जोडिनु भएको चाहिँ सुरिन्दर जोधका हुनुहुन्छ प्रोफेसर उहाँ जवाहरलाल नेहरू विश्वविद्यालयमा पढाउनुहुन्छ उहाँ र उहाँले एकदमै राम्रो एउटा बुक कास्ट इन कन्टेम्पोररी इन्डिया भनेर एकदम यो इन्ट्रेस्टिङ छ यो बुक यसमा
with various avatars, the way in which in some sense it comes to us over and over again, and it kind of even though it has been criticized, it doesn't go away. The second problem with this kind of conceptualization of caste is that it in some sense tries to think of caste in the binary framework of tradition and modern. And this binary framework itself has its own politics, its own history, its own context. Its context is that it was produced by European Enlightenment, and from European Enlightenment to the post-Second War modernization theories, where some societies were identified and characterized as traditional societies, and modern society was Europe or Western countries, and Western countries and Western kind of social life was presented as their obvious future. So this binary of tradition and modern then tries to situate caste in the domain of tradition. And since it is in the domain of tradition, its disappearance is taken for granted, right? If the societies have to become modern, they have to overcome the realities of caste. B, if they become modern, caste would automatically disappear. So if you look at the textbook literature on caste in 1960s, 70s, 80s, and to some extent the middle class common sense on caste, all of us at some level, those who have some understanding of caste, idea of caste, would immediately invoke the idea of tradition, that caste is something which is practiced in villages, caste is something which is practiced by older people, caste is something which is practiced by people who are not educated, mobile, middle class Indians and Nepalis who live in different parts of the world. They don't really care about caste. It is basically, Indians have to talk about caste because of the quota system, and India has democracy where caste is also politicized, and therefore it survives. But otherwise, everyday life in India or Nepal or anywhere else is not really, modern urban life is not centered around caste. This again is a very problematic understanding, and because this comes from the same Orientalist Eurocentric view and vision of the world. And if we have to engage with caste in the present context, in the sense in which we are talking about, we need to abandon this particular theoretical and political understanding of caste. Because as I said earlier, this kind of an understanding makes caste redundant, right? We don't really need to engage with caste if caste is about tradition. And there are some traditions which everyone has the right to preserve. I wear my turban. Who the hell are you to tell me whether I should wear turban or not? Whether once I get educated or when I become mobile, I will stop wearing turban. This is not anybody's issue. And that's how caste was engaged with by the early generation of Indians, people who started development planning in India in 1950s, somebody like Nehru, who was a very, in some sense, modern person, very educated and very well-meaning. He started planning for development, learning partly from Soviet Union, the socialist idea of development. And India was to become a democratic country. The idea was to change India, right? But how did they deal with caste? They did not deal with caste, right? You need to transform your country. You identify, in some sense, backwardness in agriculture, in rural areas. And when you go and enumerate your backwardness, you operationalize it in terms of poverty, that there are poor people, and poor people means everybody can be poor. Yes, India did affirmative action, but that was outside the domain of planning for development. And if you look at the documents of planning that Government of India created in 1950s, 60s, 70s, up to 1980s, there is no reference to caste. Poverty is a phenomenon of household, calculated in terms of caloric intake, or other kind of, what one should say, deficits in terms of housing, in terms of healthcare and stuff like that. But caste is not talked about. Why is it not talked about? The understanding is that we need to become modern. And once we become modern, caste will disappear on its own. We don't need to waste our energy on that. Even till today, we don't really have a regular data on caste created. There's a lot of demand for data on caste, except for this basic enumeration on scheduled castes. We don't really have any kind of dynamic socio-economic data on caste, and in India there has been demand from courts that we need data on caste if we want to have reservation, but there is resistance to that. And that resistance comes from this modernist binary understanding of caste being tradition and something that ought to have gone away on its own, and it would go away on its own. We don't really need to take it very seriously. Why does this understanding persist? This understanding persists because in the manner in which we have come to understand caste. And my fear is that in Nepal also, caste is being understood through Indianist kind of objective if we have to engage realities of caste. What is that Indianist perspective? Where does it come from? Indianist perspective itself was not framed by Indians. It was initially framed by European ideological scholarship in certain European countries, and that perspective, Orient, and Orient was a land of tradition, and that's how it develops in the academic writings and also in administrative and popular writings. We are starting with the term called caste. Where does the word come from? Right? The word, right? And there is no word which corresponds to caste precisely either in India or in Nepal. You have Zat, you have Jati, you have Varna, you have these other categories. And if you go and ask people about caste in different regions of India, they would give you different words. They use different kind of terminologies. I'm sure in Nepal also you have your own term. Within Nepal, you would have more than one set of terms which are used for what we middle-class Indians understand as caste. Their understanding of caste more or less concurs with our understanding of caste, but there are also significant diversities in the sense they understand hierarchy, in the sense in which they understand each other, in the sense in which they understand, say, rituals and purity and pollution, and its association with religion. So why did it come to be associated with India and South Asia? And that history goes to again, European travelers who came to India. And the first to use this term were Portuguese travelers. When they landed in Goa, they saw that there was this rigid kind of hierarchy existing in this area, and it obviously reminded them of something. And this was something which they were familiar with, right? So caste as a term has a European origin. In Europe, it was used for these rigid strata in society, and it is still used at some level, right? For example, Italy, professors are called a caste group, people which are closed in closure. So caste is a Latin European kind of word, but it came to be gradually used in India and only at the most South Asia. So initially, when it begins to be talked about, it is talked about in terms of these rigidly structured hierarchies, and then it is in some sense transferred to from social to religion, that how caste's base lies in Hindu ideology. And this Hindu ideology is inscribed in this text called Manusmriti, and therefore caste has been present for centuries, and Manusmriti at some level prescribes a particular way in which Hindu society should be organized. There are 5 varnas, starting with Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, and then there are people who are outside the caste system who will be corrected. Manu did write this text, note about it, reference in Vedas and ancient times, not to caste, but these kind of hierarchies, and which in some sense gave designation to various kinds of people. But everyone in India has not been a Hindu ever, right? Even in ancient times, so-called ancient time, there was, and this is something which brought out very well by historical research, by like our colleague in JN, Romila Thapar, who says that there has been his whole history of what she called as Shramanic tradition. And those Shramanic traditions are also there in Nepal. Buddhism, for example, is not that in some sense believes in the hierarchy, structure of hierarchy in the manner in which Hinduism believes, or Brahminical Hinduism. So within so-called Hinduism also, you have wide range of traditions where Brahmins are redundant. Brahmins don't really matter, and they're not required for ritual process. This whole what we call Bhakti tradition, it implies connecting directly with God. And there are all kinds of Bhakti things, from Ravidas, from Kabir, from Nanak, from, and in South, the movement started. Maharashtra has very strong tradition of these kind of stick to this kind of specific tradition as being practice among India was itself quite within that also only a textual construct. It was something which was textually constructed. There's no empirical knowledge which confirms that any village or any region had a strict like this, as it is stated in Manusmriti. You could have all kinds of prescriptive systems. Manusmriti is not a sacred text of the Hindus. There is no temple which where oral text. Yes, there are texts in Pali, there are texts in Tamil, there are texts in Punjabi, there are texts in every other language. Why was this one particular language selected? Because the British Orientalists and Indologists test India through Sanskritic texts, and it becomes and institutionalized. I'm using the word institutionalized because the Britishers took it very seriously. That was their sort of understanding of India and India's caste system. And then they operationalize it in their census, colonial census, beginning 1870, and they then continue to enumerate caste using Varna model of hierarchy, which turned out to be disaster. I mean, there's literature by people like Bernard Cohn and Nicholas Dirks and many others have written on the colonial census. But colonial census also provided a new awareness of caste among Indians, and the administrative categories. You don't have these varnas in many parts of the country. In South India, for example, if you go to Tamil Nadu or Kerala, you have Brahmins, and in some areas Brahmins are respected, in some areas they're not treated really very well, and have untouchables, and then you have the in-betweens, right? In-betweens are not Kriyas or Vaishyas, they are just in between. In Tamil Nadu, they came to be known as non-Brahmins. So powerful Brahmin movement. In Kerala, don't have this category called Kshatriya. No one is Kshatriya in Kerala. You have categorized as Kshatriyas. So these categories were very kind of popular in parts of North India, which then began to identify with these categories. Now, this is where I think role of nationalism becomes very critical. Leadership was in some sense educated in the, and that British system at some level also educated them about India in an Orientalist language, and they came to internalize that Orientalist language, and they began to see India from the same Orientalist colonial perspective. And this is something you can easily see in the writings of people like Nehru or Gandhi, or even to some extent Ambedkar and many others. They all have this kind of, India is land of Hindus, and all Hindus are divided in Varna hierarchy. Ambedkar very clearly writes that Varna is not really about caste, right? Varna is just a kind of classification system, and he engages with it empirically, but conceptually he also tries to kind of locate caste in tradition. Caste lives in village. Cities will not have caste, even though his own experience in some sense contradicts that point of view. But at some level, he still has a little bit of hangover of Orientalist understanding of caste. And that in some sense then also finds reference in Indian constitution after independence, that this is how caste begins to be conceptualized by social anthropologists and sociologists. And you have these scholars like Louis Dumont, who very sophisticatedly reproduce the Orientalist view of caste. And this was very conservative, that India was incapable of changing on its own, and India had been static since ancient times. This was again based on textual understanding of hierarchy. Not that hierarchies have not existed in India, not that hierarchies don't exist in India, not that hierarchies are not caste-like. They continue to kind of exist. So my final next 5 minutes, I'll try to give you what could be the alternative view of caste, which would help us engage with the realities of caste. And that alternative, yes?
So that you can summarize in 5 minutes that you were saying, alternative caste system. So one is, in our researches, we saw that as we have moved, in the capitalist system, there are some improvement, but there are places where still the situation are worse, because we hear incidents of violence be that on the in the issue of intercaste marriage, or even some do not give their house on rental to someone who are from so-called low caste. So that's what we have experienced. So what our friends have been discussing is, I mean, do you see, like, you have done your research in 15 years in North India. So do you see, like, transformation and, I mean, what is that? Like, could you shortly say on that? And next thing is, sometimes when we talk about caste system and someone who has experienced it, it's quite emotional, like you are rational, but at the same time you get emotional, and you are feeling that our grandparents generation was fighting against it, our parents generation fought against it, and we're still fighting against it. So when will we be human beings? Like when our friends are there, we see our friends being discriminated. So is it possible or not? Like, we, as you were saying about alternatives. So it would be good if you also address this question from our participants. Thank you.
See, I don't want to comment on Nepal because I don't work on Nepal. Your context is something that you know better, and your activists can engage with it very easily. You don't need my help for that. These are realities that what I was trying to kind of come to is that unless we conceptually move out of this simple prejudice understanding of caste, prejudice-centric understanding of caste, we will not be able to engage with it. Let me complete another 3-4 minutes. I didn't realize that you wanted me to intervene in this kind of question, which I'm not really capable of, and I would not really want to comment on that. In India also, the stories are many. There's not one story. But conceptually, the way we understand caste, most of these questions come from that conceptual hangover, because we still think of caste as a Hindu reality, as something which only some people practice. All of us are located in the system of caste hierarchies all over, in Kathmandu, in New Delhi, even in New York, right? So that is the starting point for my understanding of caste. Unless we engage with those realities, unless we are able to raise those kinds of questions, we will not be able to. Then we end up kind of putting the burden on the victim, that these people are orthodox, they are still trapped in the traditional mind. That's why they practice caste. So my understanding is that we need to reject that. That is something that Nepal can understand from India. Now, my just final, I'll take 2-3 minutes, and then I'll wind up, and then you can make sense of it. And if it doesn't make sense to you, I'm really very sorry. I won't be able to say much more than that. So my argument has been, this is something that I've been writing. I can also send you some of my papers, is that we need to recognize the materiality of caste. And materiality of caste is something which is responsible for its persistence. It's not very easy to we move out of caste as a social reality, carry the identities, and all of us, some level, very normally, without really thinking about it, also have caste names, and those caste names at some level convey certain things. So obviously caste needs to be seen. Also, the process is not encompassed by the reality of caste. And this category of class, which again comes to us from Western understanding, tends to be very different, and all inequalities are always also structured through institutional, where certain people are seen as being lowly. And that culture persists all across the world, and caste in some sense reinforces that. The second point about materiality of caste is that one should also look at caste as a resource. Caste is not simply a resource in negative sense of the term, that some people practice caste and violence of caste, etc. Caste is a resource, both positive as well as negative. And we should not just leave it there, because caste works as a system of network. In India, in our studies of corporate hiring and people trying to enter business, the networks are very, very critical, and urban markets are structured on caste lines. And third, finally, caste is also a habitus of privilege. One should not think caste only in terms of untouchability. One should also include privileges from a caste perspective. It's a habitus of privilege, of denial, and it's a habitus of discrimination. Unless theoretically we are able to engage in realities of caste, caste is not simply going to go away because we have become educated and we are rational. Caste is very rational, works rationally very well. And in sense, in India, after the introduction of caste has become much stronger. Caste is your insurance. Caste is your resource. Caste is how you kind of move around and where you go from migrant laborers and India, corporate hiring at the top, and all happens through caste based. I'm done. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Surinder ji. Like as you said, like in the beginning of the session, that engaging with the caste discussion, we are also making that attempt, and we don't want to reach to a final conclusion. We are just beginning, this discussion. So, as you said that you would be able to share some of your writings, so we will be really grateful to get your writings and share with our participants. And we will also share your email address so that they can, if they want to engage further with this discussion, then they could easily write you and have or enhance this discussion. So we would like to thank you on behalf of the FCD, and I know participants also there. I can see their face. So we would like to thank you for being with us. Thank you so much, and sorry for all the technical glitches. Thank you.